Thanks so much, everybody, for joining in. We'll get started in just a minute or two. Hello, my name is Jeff Abramson. I'm a senior fellow at the Arms Control Association. I also manage something called the Forum on the Arms Trade, which is a network of more than 100 experts around the world who work on arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use issues. We're really delighted you could join with us today, and our co-hosts, the ICBL-CMC, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, Cluster Munition Coalition, the ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons and Control Arms. I think we're in for a really great conversation about some proven approaches to address some of these treaty issues in arms trade and security, arms trade and disarmament and weapons control issues, including product-based exclusions, and then sort of the newer and developing behavior-based exclusions. My job is not to really introduce, but to tell you a little bit more about the technology we'll be using today. Obviously, we're on Zoom, and this is also being live streamed on YouTube, so you can check the video out afterwards if you want to come back to it. That'll be on the forum's website. You'll see that there is chat enabled. That chat is primarily for the participants, for you all to have a great conversation, a respectful conversation amongst yourselves, reactions, sharing of resources, and so forth. But there's also a Q&A, and we strongly encourage questions to be put into the Q&A. That's where the panelists will be looking for questions from you. It's a bit too difficult for us to both check the Q&A as well as the chat. So please do use the Q&A. There is an option, and it'll be up to the moderator to make this happen, to ask to raise your hand and actually verbally ask your question. We'll sort of see how things are going, but we're really looking forward to this being as interactive as possible. At the end, you'll be taken to a little feedback survey. We'd welcome your comments on how this went. We're always looking to do better and see if there was more we should have addressed. But with that, I would like to turn it over to our moderator, who is Camilo Serna, who is the Deputy Director and co-founder of the Columbia Campaign Against Landmines. I've known Camilo quite a while, and Susi and I, who were working a ton with him when the pandemic started last year, we were having meetings, and we would sort of check with Camilo to see if he was available, because if he was available, it meant there wasn't another coalition meeting going on, because Camilo is so involved with so many different campaigns within the international humanitarian disarmament movement. He is also a regional leader within the NGO CELAC, which is Seguridad Humana en Latinoamérica y el Caribe, the human security in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm really delighted to turn it over to you, Camilo, to moderate our conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeff. And a very special greeting this day, and welcome to this panel, Evolving Financial Approach to Disarmament and Weapons. As Jeff said before starting, those who have questions can ask them through the Q&A box. We appreciate your company and highlight our co-sponsors, the Forum on Arms Trade, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, Cluster Munition Coalition, ICBL-CMC, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and Control Arms. Originating in the 1990s, the concept of humanitarian disarmament is established as a framework that aims to prevent and remediate arms-inflicted human suffering and environmental harm. All this through the establishment and implementation of norms, the main of them promoted by the co-sponsor of this event. The 1997 Man-Bind Treaty, the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munition, and the 2017 Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons present prohibitions on assistance, extend to the financing or investment in companies manufacturing or developing banned weapons. The 2013 Arms Trade Treaty also includes prohibition and regulations that the international community must take into account when attempting to carry out a transaction involving conventional weapons. Specifically, not one should invest in weapons that are prohibited by international law. Our panelists, expert on the subject of humanitarian disarmament, will delve into such important topic as the product-based exclusions, the behavior-based exclusion and industry engagement, and how investment community industry has been coming on board with this concept. We must highlight the growing interest of several countries sitting in the first committee on the financing of weapons, many of them from the global south, and the growing concern of some important financial entities for not investing in development or prohibit or question weapons will be the subject of this discussion. Please let me introduce you our first panelist, Susi Snyder, who is the financial sector coordinator at the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. She facilitates engagement with and by the financial sector on nuclear weapons, relate issues, and also coordinate the Don't Bank on the Bomb project. She is also the Nuclear Disarmament Program Manager at PAX and has over 2 decades experience working at the intersection between nuclear weapons and human rights. Susi will kick off the conversation talking about product-based exclusion. Please, Susi.
Thank you so much, Camilo, and thank you everyone who has joined us here today. I'm really excited to be here. I love talking about this issue and the way that maybe unusual actors can help us limit and eliminate controversial weapons or inhumane and indiscriminate weapons. The first thing I want to do is I've been spending a lot of time with others within the financial sector in the last couple of years. So I just want to clarify a term that y'all might hear and not really think about. And that's environmental, social, and governance, ESG. And I just want to make it clear, ESG doesn't mean it's really good. ESG is just a way to sort of measure, it's a set of metrics, and they're not always the same, that are applied to how you can judge investments. It doesn't guarantee that an investment is not harmful. And I think that's an important distinction and an important thing to start off with, because there are a lot of funds, a lot of institutions, a lot of banks, asset managers, they're saying, hey, we're great on ESG. But I'll tell you, some of the biggest weapons producers in the world, like Lockheed Martin, also says, hey, we're great on ESG. So it's a broad criteria, and it can mean a lot of different things. So like everything, you can't just kind of take someone's word for it. You have to look a little bit deeper. When I'm looking at these questions, I look more at where do folks go, not just from their ESG criteria, but how do they take that into sustainability or responsible investment? And it's in that area that we start to see product-based exclusions. And that's where investors don't want to invest in companies that make specific products. So for example, tobacco. Tobacco has been on the blacklist of investment for a while. Now, it's not illegal, but it's known to be harmful, despite a lot of industry pushing earlier that it was fine. We know that this is a harmful substance, and a lot of investors won't invest in tobacco companies. And there's also a historic avoidance of what are sometimes called sin stocks, alcohol, pornography, again, things that are not illegal per se, but are known to have negative effects on society. And what we're seeing is the avoidance of investment of different types of weapons is growing. And part of that is because the international legal regimes and norms are growing. I often point to the Chemical Weapons Convention as a first example of understanding how when you prohibit a weapon, you are also prohibiting financing of that weapon, because under the Oxford interpretation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, it's laid out. The prohibition on assistance also means financing. states parties to the Convention on Cluster Munitions have actually elaborated that much further. And they also wanted to clarify that the assistance clause is slightly different than in the Prohibition on Chemical Weapons. 11 states parties to the Convention on Cluster Munitions have enacted specific national legislation that prevents financing of the companies involved in the production of cluster munitions. There's another 35 that have issued interpretive statements indicating that they find that financing to be problematic and in contravention of the Cluster Munitions Convention. This is such an important issue and such an impactful issue that during the negotiation for the Dubrovnik Action Plan coming out of the Convention on Cluster Munitions, to look at how to get every country in the world on board that convention, one of the suggestions was, hey, when you're doing your national legislation that you're required to do to ratify, make sure you make part of that legislation a prohibition on investment in the producers of cluster munitions. And the reason that's been encouraged is because it works. It works. Ending cluster munitions financing across many countries has resulted in ending the production of cluster munitions from companies that are headquartered in countries that are not part of the treaty. So those companies are not under a legal requirement to stop producing because of the treaty, but we've managed to put so much pressure on them financially that they have said, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. Even some of the biggest arms manufacturers in the world have said, oh, we want to keep our door open to investors everywhere. We're not going to renew or get new contracts for the production of cluster munitions. There are very few producers left, and they are stigmatized in most markets. There are hundreds of exclusions for the companies that still produce cluster bombs. And again, there's only a couple. This is an effective tool to bring in and to increase the normative impact of the treaty. Now, the latest humanitarian disarmament treaty that Camilo mentioned is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It went into effect in January. And during the negotiations, there were a lot of countries who raised concerns about financing, saying, they want financing to be prohibited as part of this treaty. And there was a discussion during, with several states during the negotiations, and the decision was to use the same language on the prohibition of assistance as we find in the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Convention on Chemical Weapons, in which that prohibition on assistance also applies to providing financial assistance. Cuba, when it ratified the nuclear weapon ban treaty, also included an explicit declaration about that very thing. And it said the financing of any activity prohibited to a state party under this treaty is also a prohibited activity according to the provisions of the treaty. Now, since the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, we've seen, and again, that was in January, we've seen investment and financing relationships end from states parties, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks. And we've also seen it end from financial institutions operating within their jurisdictions. So a number of countries, we've seen, earlier this year, it was reported that Ireland's sovereign wealth fund divested from over $6 billion in stocks and other holdings from companies related to the production of nuclear weapons. Since the ban treaty opened for signature just a few years ago, we've seen annual drops in the number of financial relationship with the most heavily involved companies producing nuclear weapons. I just did a quick look at the loans. Loans are longer-term financing relationships. And to give a company a loan, you have to believe in that company a little bit more than just buying a stock on the market. And I've seen a 40% drop since the treaty opened for signature in the number of financial institutions, mostly banks, willing to give loans to companies producing nuclear bombs. And part of that might be because at least two of these companies have lost what were formerly thought to be non-revocable contracts. Again, there are pressures on the market, there are pressures on these companies. And all of these situations illustrate how product-based exclusions, so saying you will not invest in a company because of what it makes, can strengthen and build on the normative impact of a prohibition treaty. It's a way for those who are maybe not ready to join the treaty to take other actions to help strengthen the goal and the intent of the treaty itself. In the last couple of years, the number of financial institutions specifically excluding civilian firearms is also going up. And there's a number of concerns and investment avoidance on other weapons as well. I'm seeing in policies from some mid-range banks that they will not invest in emerging weapon systems like lethal autonomous weapons. And quite a lot of policies saying that they will avoid any company involved in producing other indiscriminate weapons, whether it be incendiary weapons like white phosphorus, depleted uranium weapons, and so on and so forth. This seems to be the financial sector taking some preparation and getting ready for future humanitarian disarmament instruments, and also recognizing their own role in reducing harm caused by the production, use, manufacture, trade, and development of these inhumane and indiscriminate weapons. Thanks.
Thank you, Susi. Our next panelist is Oudes, is the project lead on conflict, human rights, and the financial sector at PAX. He leads the work of PAX in the Fair Finance Guide, an international network seeking to make finance more responsible. Some of his recent work has examined how and whether financial institutions invest in companies that sell weapon systems to countries in conflict. Cor, please share your insights into behavior-based exclusion and other efforts dealing with regulating the conventional arms trade. Please, Cor.
Yes, thank you, Camille, very much. And also thanks to the Forum on Arms Trade and its partners for organizing and hosting this event. And thank you all for joining. I'll speak today about the financial sector action based on company behavior. And I'd like to briefly introduce this by focusing on three main points. First, the issue that we're looking at, which is harm to civilians and violations of human rights. And then what international standards say about the responsibilities of arms companies in protecting human rights. Lastly, the role of international finance and the role that they should be playing. First, on the issue that we're actually talking about. The issues covered by Susi Snyder are caused by specific products. She spoke about weapon systems that, because of their very nature, cause indiscriminate harm when used. We see, however, that such indiscriminate weapons are not the only issue in conflict zones. In many conflicts around the world, civilians become victims of weapons that in and of themselves are not indiscriminate. However, they are deployed with indiscriminate effects. As is very understandable, with most weapons, it's primarily the user of the weapon that determines what effects the weapons will have on the ground. Any bomb targeted on a civilian structure causes the very harm that we're trying to get rid of. And this means that if we want to address the issue of civilian harm in conflicts, no one entry point is how arms producers behave, not just in terms of the kinds of weapons that they produce, but also in terms of who they are selling all weapons they produce to. Selling weapon systems to some governments will generate a higher chance of weapons being misused than selling them to other governments. And the issue here is thus with how the arms company behaves in terms of its policy and practice on arms sales. And we're seeing this is of growing concern for investors in arms companies as well, as they, rightly so, see themselves as part of the value chain, of which ultimately also the use of weapons is a part. I move to the international standards for the behavior of arms companies in relation to human rights now, which is the second point I'd like to address. What we're seeing over the past years is that a growing number of financial institutions refer to the Arms Trade Treaty in their policies on responsible investment. And this is logical, as this treaty is the main international guideline on arms exports. It enshrines the obligation of states to, put bluntly, avoid that they allow arms exports from their country to parties that might violate international humanitarian law or target civilians. While directed at state behavior, this treaty has, I believe, clear implications for company behavior as well. It is based on values that lead to the basic principle that I just described, namely that companies should not be selling weapons to state if they know that the risk of misuse is high. Similar values are laid down a bit more specific in the European Union Common Position on Arms Exports, which deals with arms exports from European Union countries. And while these standards lay down norms around arms trade, the UN guiding principles and the closely connected OECD guidelines on responsible investment and company behavior, they lay down more general guidelines for companies and also by states, by the way, to prevent, mitigate, and remediate human rights violations. And under these guidelines, companies, and that includes arms producers naturally, should conduct human rights due diligence. They should do this to avoid becoming involved in human rights abuses. And in terms of behavior, this clearly demands from arms producers that they screen for risks amongst their clients. They should do this to avoid selling weapons to states that are at a higher risk of abusing these and violating IHL and human rights in the process. I move to my third point, which is how international finance should interact with this discussion. What we see quite generally in financial institutions is that they exclude companies or financing of arms transactions to sanctioned countries that are under an embargo. And while this is important and very much in line with the Arms Trade Treaty, it is the lowest bar. Several financial institutions do also reference the Arms Trade Treaty specifically in their responsible investment policies. And this is a clear signal that they see the Arms Trade Treaty as relevant for their human rights due diligence. So the Arms Trade Treaty is relevant for the human rights due diligence of financial institutions when investing in arms producing companies. We're also seeing, however, that these financial institutions sometimes also invest in many arms companies involved in arms trade to countries that we consider to be at high risk of misuse. In the Netherlands, PAX has published several reports highlighting arms trades to high-risk countries as a risk for financial institutions. Because of their business relationship with arms producers through a loan or an investment, financial institutions have a responsibility to take action if the arms company they invest in continues to supply weapons that are misused. And we've seen a number of financial institutions include human rights concerns, as well as other concerns, like for instance, around corruption or local government stability, in their investment policy for the defense sector. This generates engagement of the financial sector with arms producers, which is aimed not at stopping the production of specific and certain weapons, but rather changing the behavior of arms producing companies. In a way that they stop selling or start screening their possible clients in a better way. And this is a field that's still in development. Some financial institutions have chosen to exclude arms companies more rigorously or overall, and others open dialogue with arms producing companies to seek behavior change on their part. Given the enormous risk for people in conflict zones all over the world, it is important that financial institutions take up their role in this product chain very seriously. Around the issue of arms trade, this could mean exclusion of arms producers, but because the actual ask is to change company behavior, engagement could also be a viable strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cole. Our next panelist is Marybeth Gallagher. Is a leading expert in social responsibility investing and is now Director of Engagement at Domini Impact Investments, LLC. Domini is a woman-led registered investment advisor specializing exclusively in impact investing, managing more than $3 billion in assets. Marybeth is also an attorney and former executive director of Investor Advocates for Social Justice, IASG. Marybeth, please help us understand what you are seeing in terms of industry taking up the concept Susi and Cor introduced, and where do you see things going?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate today. My name is Marybeth Gallagher, and as Camilo mentioned, I work with Domini Impact Investments as the Director of Engagement. Domini is a mutual fund based in the US, and we have a commitment to advancing investments that support ecological sustainability and universal human dignity. And we use several tools to carry out this work, including applying a series of investment standards to our investable universe and engagement tools, which Cor was speaking at the end of his presentation. Just to orient the community to some of the investor strategies, I'm going to first outline some of the tools that we use in terms of standards, screens, and evaluating company performance using the environmental social governance framework that Susi briefly mentioned. And then talk a little bit about shareholder advocacy and engagement with companies and its goals and how it seeks to encourage behavior change within companies. First, to speak about the investment standards, I'll use Domini as an example. So Domini applies a series of criteria and key performance indicators to evaluate which companies would be in our investable universe. We have certain thresholds or standards that we apply. So there are certain companies whose business model is fundamentally misaligned with our core objectives of supporting universal human dignity and ecological sustainability. So for example, we would not invest in a company that derives more than 10% of its revenue from any weapons. We also closely evaluate on a case-by-case basis any companies with a lower threshold of involvement and whether they would be a suitable investment. And then we think about sort of once a company is in our investable universe, what are the tools and impact levers that we have to try to encourage improved practices or stronger performance? And we rely heavily on the framework of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which Core also mentioned, that have the premise that companies have fundamental responsibilities to respect human rights, separate and distinct from the obligations of the state. And so what we want to understand from companies is how they implement their human rights commitments in a policy, how they identify potential risks and impacts associated with their core business and the use of their products and services, and consider steps to prevent or mitigate potential harm. Domini, as I mentioned, does not invest in weapons companies, so we're not engaging in those dialogues. But there are many faith-based investors and other investors who might hold small exposure to those companies that are seeking to use investor tools to try to influence behavior. Some of these tools include investor letters, where investors will gather together and signal concerns and seek increased disclosure. How can we evaluate what your policy is, how you're implementing it, how you're engaging with relevant stakeholders in a company that's producing key components for nuclear weapons? For example, we might ask about whether that business model is fundamentally just misaligned with respect for human rights, and if they should consider strategic direction changes in terms of their business model's long-term resilience for a peaceful and just world. Knowing that business model change is really challenging to accomplish, we'd also look at how the policies they do have in place impact their business practices. So, for example, faith-based investors might engage a company as they have in the past, and as I was doing with my previous employer, for example, engaging Northrop Grumman on how it conducts a human rights impact assessment, a company that has a human rights policy but is involved in business that is so highly risky for human life and dignity. How can they have a human rights policy and continue to have those business relationships? Are there products they should not sell or customers they should not do business with? And that's the focus of an engagement. Shareholders can use tools like dialogue, where they're meeting with company executives to try to gather information, encourage changing of practices, encourage more robust human rights due diligence and disclosure. And they can also use more public-facing tools like shareholder proposals, which are filed by investors who hold adequate shares in a company, and those are voted on by all shareholders at a company's annual general meeting. And in the past proxy season, which is when annual meetings take place, the faith-based investors had filed proposals with Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, and also financiers of nuclear weapons, PNC, really seeking more information on human rights due diligence. And those shareholder proposals actually did quite well, receiving support from 30% or more of investors. So it shows that expectations of the financial community of companies involved in this business are increasing. Investors want companies to really closely evaluate the contours of their own responsibilities relative to states, and increasing regulatory expectations around mandatory human rights due diligence, and evaluating the end use of products and services that a company makes only strengthen that case. So again, to summarize the landscape of tools investors use, it would be something like a screen or a standard to pick which companies they want to put their capital into. And then engagement tools like shareholder dialogue, shareholder letters, filing shareholder proposals that seek to try to encourage changes in company practices. And as Susi is tracking, there are an increasing number of investors that are establishing screens that are product-based or behavior-based, and increasing support for active investor engagement, seeking meaningful information about human rights due diligence and practice from these companies. So with that, I'll pause and welcome any questions about investor tools or how collaboration with a financial community that's really committed to investing for good, that is looking at evaluating company practices and behaviors and business models with the lens towards improving practices, how that can move forward effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Marybeth. I have some questions from the participants. I need to read the questions because we are recording. So the first one is, when large banks are pressured to divest from weapons production, does private finance, venture capital, private equity just step in to fill that void? The increasing participants of venture capital in encouraging civilian tech firms and startups to develop military applications for their technologies, and the growth of weapons technology focused investment vehicles like Veritas Capital, Civitas Group, Arlington Capital Partners, Bearman Capitals, and Paladin Capital, etc., is really concerning. Given the increasing influence of such private finance, should they not also be a target of such awareness and pressure campaigns? So who wants to answer the first question? Susi?
Well, I'll try to jump in a little bit. This is a great question, and thank you very much for asking it. Just a couple of days ago, I saw an article quickly blip by a screen talking about how private equity and venture capital are picking up where the fossil fuel divestment movement has, picking up investments in oil and other fossil fuels now that a lot of major institutions are stepping away from that. So it's a really pertinent question because we're seeing this discussion. One of the challenges that I find kind of doing research in this area is finding out the details. It's a lot harder to find some of this information about private equity, that and venture capital. That said, some of the information is available. With the Don't Bank on the Bomb project, what we do is we go and we list every investor that we can get our hands on, and we publish it on our website. We do apply a stock and bond holding threshold, but it's a very small one. And we have, a couple hundred investors listed, including some of these capital groups. Again, I think it's worth shining a light on. This is also a challenge, I think, within the broader financial sector as a whole when it comes to varieties in transparency, reporting, and filing obligations. And I think, when I talk to Marybeth, who's working with a mutual fund with Domini, it's a much different reality because it's very clear what Domini invests in and what it doesn't. And you can ask. With these funds, it's can be a lot trickier to get in the door to start those conversations. At least that's been my experience, and I'm sure others here have others. But I think it's very good. I think we do need to definitely start flashing some lights in that dark corner of the sector.
I can just add a little.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead, Camilo. I was going to just add, I agree with Susi that there's an analogy with the fossil fuel divestment. And I think that was a few years ago seen as a reason why against the divestment movement, like somebody else will just fill that capital gap. And I think for sure that is a concern. We don't want anyone investing in these companies and these harmful products and services. But for those institutions that have accountability to their beneficiaries and stakeholders, and transparency expectations. It's important for them to signal that investment in these types of companies is inappropriate for transparency, for alignment with values. And I think the movement of investors that want to commit to social and environmental good through their capital is really increasing. It doesn't change the dynamics around private equity and the vehicles to encourage more transparency, disclosure, and oversight of private equity. That conversation needs to continue, but that shouldn't halt the practices of investors having strong standards.
Thanks. Cord, do you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question. Also, it points to a gap in many of the campaigning that's been going on. Which has been based on consumers, on getting consumers to realize that what happens with their savings and with their pension premiums actually has an effect in the world, and that's less the case, or more indirectly the case with venture capital and other private capital investment vehicles. I do believe, and I agree with Marybeth, that the role of these campaigns in creating a stigma around certain weapons does in the end also have an effect, although it might be lesser on these capital investment firms as well. And then, of course, we've seen around, for instance, around cluster munitions that some of the treaties have been able to actively prohibit investments, and that, of course, applies to these capital managers as well. So yeah, but it's a valuable point.
Thank you, Cor. There is anyone to jump in to say something more? No? Okay, we will go with the next question. How can this type of engagement be promoted to SADC countries for government officials to engage in same discussion and set this type of discourse?
So
Susi?
you all know me and know I like to talk. Sorry, but on this is something where this is how when a country is looking to do its ratification of an international treaty, what does that mean nationally? What does it mean for the interpretation? And I think there's a real benefit in having a clear declaration, a clear understanding of the broad analysis that you can't, if you're going to prohibit any sort of assistance with the production, development, manufacture, use, or testing of a weapon, that also means money, and making that clear. So I would say a couple of things is the engagement between ministries of foreign affairs, the ministry responsible for the national or the parties responsible for the national implementation legislation, and ministries of finance, to make sure that the central bank or any sovereign funds, sovereign controlled funds, do not risk financial exposure to these types of weapons, to the prohibited weapons. Those are conversations that can take place in a public way. They can take place in a very quiet way, and have some nice results as well. And that's what I'm seeing with I've recently begun speaking with a lot more Latin American institutions who are, I'm talking about nuclear weapons, and they look at me, they're like, Susi, come on, we're not going to invest in nuclear weapons because our country supports the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We've been a long-term member of the Latin American nuclear weapon free zone. We're never going to do this because we know, and we're going to steer clear. We've heard from our Ministry of Finance, it's a bad thing to do. There's an interpretation and an understanding of a whole of society rejection of the weapon. And so I think that in a lot of these countries, that's a nice step to go. And it's something that can then be reported back at meetings of states parties, or right now in the General Assembly. In the first committee, in discussions about how are treaties being implemented, how are they being talked about, what's going on to prevent harm, right? The whole point of this is to prevent harm. And this is something that, within the SADC countries and others can very well come back and say, hey, this side of the issue is something that we have also paid attention to. We have had conversations. We've followed the models, the implementation models, and we've included this as well. And I think sharing those experiences is really important. And it's something, again, it can have it can have effects like create a positive momentum as well. And one thing I'd like to point out is often it's the same group of companies that make some of these weapons. So it's kind of easy if you're going to stop investing in one, stop investing in all, because it's not that many companies at the end of the day. It's not like a whole sector. And so, yeah, so I'd leave it there.
Thank you, Susi. Core, do you have anything to complement this from the side of the ATT, for example?
No, I don't at the moment. No, I agree with Susi, and I'd like to add that many of the campaigning instruments that we're trying to develop also to, of course, the world of international finance is very much interlinked. So there's a lot of connections between banks all over the world and everywhere in the world. So it's very likely that a bank in any country will have a link with other banks. And what we're trying to increasingly do is make information about what we know about which bank is doing what transparent and bring that out in the open, also for local communities to engage with their own bank in their own country, which of course includes the SEDA countries.
Thank you, Core. If there is no more, I will jump to the next question. How to implement strongly by all state parties on arms trade treaty. It is connected with most of the governments and organizations.
Yeah, I'd like to get into that. So what we see, I mentioned in my talk that we see some financial institutions mentioning the arms trade treaty in their policy, and what's useful to expand on a little bit is that we see that sometimes financial institutions do translate this into also relaying the responsibility to the government, which of course is very much in line with the arms trade treaty, which places the responsibility, rightfully so, in the hands of the government to grant export licensing. What the risk is, however, is that financial institutions sort of stop at that and say, well, the buck stops not here with us, but the buck stops over there with the government, and it shouldn't, because governments have a responsibility. Governments, but companies have, including financial institutions, have a responsibility in their own right, in their own merit, which is much more emphasized by the UN guiding principles and by the OECD guidelines. So, where we very much encourage that financial institutions rely on the values that underpin the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty, and also provide the ATT as a basis for their responsible investment policy. We do encourage financial institutions to put this also in the framework of other guidelines that place this responsibility much more firmly with the financial institution, with the company itself, because that's where key decisions are being taken as well. And we see that governments act differently around the responsibilities laid down with government in the Arms Trade Treaty for one reason, for instance, because they are not party to the Arms Trade Treaty, and for another that they sometimes evaluate choices that they have to make in a different way. So that by definition creates a responsibility for arms companies, but also for arms producing companies and for financial institutions to do their own screening in light of human rights violation risk, as well as risk of violations of international humanitarian law, for which, when you look specifically at the defense sector and arms producing companies, the ATT can provide a useful underpinning, but does really require putting the responsibility on the company itself as well.
Thank you. Anyone? No? Okay. Our next question is arms company lobbying of authorities still an obstacle? And has there been any success in curtailing it?
I really want to jump
Susi?
in on this, and yeah, I really want to jump in, and I also want to recognize I see a member participating in the audience who has just launched a report earlier this week on the role of the nuclear weapons producing companies in their contributions to U.S. Congress persons and the way that they are buying influence. Bill Hartung is a brilliant one of my mentors and a brilliant writer on these issues and has been for a while. And I think I hope he puts the link to his report in the chat because it's spectacular and I'd commend it to anyone. There is a direct link between excuse me, can't say that. There is a clear line that can be drawn between contributions to from arms companies to political candidates, to active legislators, to think tanks that write about weapons and weapons issues, and to other lobbying firms. We see very clearly that the arms industry spends a lot of money lobbying. And they get results. They really do. When you look at the dollar for dollar impact of every dollar spent lobbying, it averages out about $200 comes back in contract money, and that's just what's been disclosed. And so there's a lot that goes through. That doesn't include political action committees. That doesn't include campaign contributions. It's an investment that the industry does make, and it does restrict the conversation. Who gets listened to when there's a U.S. Senate hearing on arms issues? If it's a civil society person, they do not have to disclose whether or not they are funded or financed in any way by the arms industry. And it's only a voluntary disclosure that even members of Congress have to make about whether or not they have those relationships. So this is a big problem. And so that lobbying does restrict progressive legislation. Now, I'm most familiar with the situation in the US, but there are also some parallels that can be drawn in France as well. And I recently just begun looking at that a lot more. And there is a big impact. There's a lot of money spent within France on defense sector lobbying that then comes back to the companies that are involved in at least producing France's nuclear arsenal. And it's awkward because especially for France, because some of its arsenal components are made in Italy or in the Netherlands or in Germany. So it's a bit tricky when you get there and transnational lobbying questions as well. I won't delve into that, but there's definitely an issue here, and it's something that needs attention. And it's a question, to me, it's a question of whether you can make a clear decision or whether the decision on a policy is influenced, and how thin is the line between influence and corruption. And that's a question I'll leave for other people to think about.
This is Marybeth. I'll just add that investors are seeking increased disclosure from companies around their lobbying, political spending, trade association memberships. And I think it really gets to the question of accountability and responsibility too. If companies are deferring their responsibilities to states that they're heavily influencing through their political spending and lobbying, we have concerns about the oversight and the framework that's sort of playing the role of guardrails on responsible conduct. And I think it makes the case that investors really need to press companies on how they're meeting their responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights on their own to evaluate whether certain contracts or areas of business are appropriate. So it's such an important question, and the concerns around the flow of money into legislatures and states, I think warrants continued scrutiny.
Thank you, Marybeth. Anyone want to add something before I mention the next question? No?
Yeah, I'd like to briefly, I mean, we see some movement, of course, among government as well. I mean, there's not perhaps a specific link to lobbying, but you see that some governments are actively requiring companies, financial institutions to and other companies to adhere to basic standards like the UN Guiding Principles. And we've recently seen also in the context of Flanders, we've seen that the Flanders government indicated specifically in an overview of arms exports that took place over the past period of time, they indicated that they had placed the responsibility of exporting and selling weapons responsibly, very specifically in the hands of the company, which many governments have made its statement about responsible company behavior in general terms, but to make it that specifically related to arms exports was a new one that recently happened. Yeah, governments do play that role as well.
Thank you, Cor. Well, the next question is, how would you compare disinvestment and engagement in terms of efficacy and efforts engagement required?
I can start on that question. So I think just to define the terms a little bit, divestment is if you own shares in a company and you make a stance either due to concerns around the long-term business viability of that company or based on your values and principles that you're going to sell your shares in that company. So you divest. What I described of Domini's approach on standards is we would choose not to make an investment in weapons. So we didn't have to divest. We didn't ever own those companies. So I think it requires establishing your guidelines and principles around the type of industries your institution or you as an individual investor wants to put your money into, and sort of articulating that to those people who manage your money. So if you own those companies, how do you want to exit them? Or do you want to choose to never own those companies? And then turning to the question of engagement, if you are a part owner in a company, you have responsibilities, and you also have opportunities to try to influence that company through the shareholder advocacy tools I've mentioned. In terms of effort, engagement is effort, and it's not a guaranteed outcome that you'll be successful, but I think it helps to raise visibility on emerging risks and try to encourage companies to have more responsible practices. There's also a segment of companies that divestment may not be the appropriate, or divestment or screens might not be the appropriate approach, but you still want to try to encourage different behavior. And that's where resources like Don't Bank on the Bomb come in to play, where you might evaluate banks that have exposure to the arms producing companies, and you want to encourage them to either closely scrutinize those companies before making loans or investments into them, or to stop those practices. And engagement can be a specific tool in those instances to try to encourage a company whose overall business model is fundamentally aligned, but has certain practices that are problematic, or relationships with certain stakeholders that present risks. So the range of tools available to different kinds of institutional investors really varies. Some institutions don't have as much flexibility to divest or screen out a whole sector, but when they are exposed, like some universal owners who just invest through an index fund where they have less discretion over what companies they hold in that fund, engagement would be a really important tool for them to use their ownership and leverage through that. So I think there's sort of a spectrum of how investors look at these tools, and when sort of one starts and stops depends on your goals, your values, how much flexibility you have, and how you want to engage. Others may have points to add to that too.
Thank you, Marybeth.
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to expand a bit on the point that Marybeth is mentioning on this being on the spectrum, and because I notice in the debate around responsible investment internationally that they're often sort of confronted with each other and put as opposing options in front of each other, while they're very much connected, of course. If even a small amount of money is being divested from a company for its production of nuclear weapons, or for its sales of weapons to countries waging war in Yemen, for instance, it of course, if you want to generate the effects that have an impact on the ground, it helps even if you divest, to send a letter to the company to let them know we're divesting from your company because you're involved in the production of nuclear weapons. And we recently updated our investment principles, and we currently hold investment principles that determine that is unacceptable. And the other way around is true as well. If you choose to engage with a company, it is my belief that it works to do that if there is something that closes the door as well. So continuous engagement over longer periods of time doesn't in the end necessarily help people on the ground that are suffering consequences sometimes from company behavior. And that's true for the arms industry, but it's true for any industry. So this type of engagement, in my view, works best when divestment is also an option and is put on the table by investors as an option as well. Listen, if this type of behavior continues over the coming period of time, this is your time frame for change. And after that, it's going to be over, our business relationship.
Thank you, Cor. We don't have, we have another question. No, we don't have any more. So if any of you have any other point that you like to make or any final remarks that you want to raise, Susi?
Gosh, there's been so many interesting things that we've talked about here today. It's a lot to take in, and I'm digesting it and thinking about it. And one of the things I might want to bring back is how does this kind of play out in disarmament discussions that many of us are familiar with within the UN system? How do we talk about this? How does this come back into that conversation? Where can we go to make our treaties, our instruments, our norms more impactful and more effective? And I think one of the things that we've touched on here is how, in some situations, these product-based exclusions, for example, come out of human rights policies. They come out of efforts to reduce harm. Some institutions take as the baseline, they will not invest in anything that causes indiscriminate harm or violates the law in any of the jurisdictions that they have operations. So there's a lot of space here for that. And I think as the efforts to involve the financial sector, to involve the business community in a lot more discussions around global governance. And we see this happening with sustainable development goals. We see this happening when it comes to the whole business and human rights movement and efforts there, that we've got to sort of step out of our usual comfort zones a little bit, and think big and think bold. Because there is an opportunity to create change. There's a wave of change happening now to address the climate, this existential threat that we're all facing. And these are things that are part of that as well. And I think we shouldn't underestimate how important it is, and how important it is to make a connection that a strong policy from our financial sector can have impact on weapons. It can have impact for the benefit of human rights. It can have impact on the climate, and it can contribute to a better society, as opposed to one that's not so nice. I think that's our goal, right? We want a better world for everyone. So I hope that we can think about that and think about how maybe some of our traditional silos can be opened up a bit in moving on these issues.
Thank you, Susi. Cor?
No, I think I agree with Susi. I think the link between those discussions is very very important, and the financial sector increasingly is taking up a role in the field of business conflict and human rights, and I think this helps. I mean, one of the sayings that goes around in the climate movement a bit is, which is also increasingly focused on the financial sector, is where the money where the money goes today, the world goes tomorrow, and that's so a lot of the decisions about, as Susi is saying, about the way our world looks tomorrow. Perhaps tomorrow shouldn't be taken too literally here, but a lot of these decisions are being taken in financial sector boardrooms. So there's a very clear connection between the discussions taking place around humanitarian disarmament in the United Nations and what's happening in arms production facilities and eventually in conflict zones in many cases, unfortunately. So there's a lot of work to be done in this field. Is my belief.
Thank you, Cor. And Marybeth, do you want to also answer some question about ETFs that are in the chat?
Sure, thanks, Camilo. So somebody had posed a question in the chat about options for retail investors and where to put your money. And I think sort of like building on what Susi and Cor have just shared, like really investing in the future you believe in is something that I think anyone who has access to capital or participates in places where they can use their leverage, like it's appropriate to use your voice and leverage in all of those different ways. And so I put in response to that question a resource called Weapons Free Funds that's run by As You Sow, and an individual who's a retail investor could sort of like evaluate ETFs and mutual funds like Domini that anyone an individual can invest in, and you can see sort of how it ranks on its position related to weapons. And if you are invested in a traditional kind of ETF that does have exposure to these companies, it's also important to use your voice. So like I mentioned earlier about shareholder proposals that are voted on by institutional investors at their shareholder meeting. Those proposals are also voted on by mutual funds and ETFs like BlackRock and Vanguard, and scrutiny over how those institutions are voting those shares is important. If you're an investor in one of those institutions, you might ask how they voted on certain shareholder proposals that are addressing human rights concerns and encourage them to support them, because that reinforces the signal that financial institutions have concerns about human rights responsibilities and want a company to know and show that it's respecting human rights. And ETF's an exchange traded fund. It's a financial vehicle that has exposure to an index of funds and sort of tracks the S&P 500. I am not on the investment side of the house, so I'm going to encourage you to look that up on Investopedia before I say something inaccurate. But an ETF is basically an accessible and easy investment vehicle that any individual can invest in with even a small amount of money. So it basically is tied to the S&P 500 and therefore has exposure to all of the companies in there. And it's harder when you're investing in a mutual fund like that to have a screen or to divest. And the tool that I referenced includes mutual funds and ETFs that apply a screen based on commonly held concerns like tobacco or fossil fuels or weapons. So it's just to say that there are options out there for investors to sort of align their values more easily. And if you're not able to invest through one of those vehicles, then like you still have a voice if you have exposure. Like if you're a pensioner with a public pension fund, like it would be interesting for you to ask them how they're invested, whether they engage or screen or vote their proxies in a particular way. And all of this sort of reinforces, again, the signals around how an institution believes others in the ecosystem should behave. I hope that's helpful to the question, and apologies for the use of jargon there.
Do you want to say anything more or a final remark?
No, I just really appreciate the conversation, and I like the connection of the different leverage points and tools. I think it's really important for different actors to understand sort of how different tools can reinforce each other and support each other when there's a set of values that a group of people believe in, to think about all the different leverage points that might be brought to bear. So really thank you for the conversation and inviting me to join today.
Thank you, Marybeth. We had an interesting conversation, and that should be important to continue in all areas of the humanitarian disarmament. I want to reaffirm no one should invest in weapons that are prohibited by international law. Thanks to the participants, our panelists, and to our co-sponsor, Jeff, I back to you. Thank you.
Let me also thank everyone for joining in, and especially the panelists for providing their expertise on this. There's many things I learned. Is also I wish I had taken better notes, but the video will be available afterwards. And as you exit, please do take the survey that we have for you. And let me just thank everyone here, as well as the co-sponsoring organizations. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. See you again soon, I hope.
Thank you. Yeah, bye-bye.